All right, guys, we're going to keep going with understanding complex sentences. If you've been following along with me up to this point, you should be at about 63%, and you should have about 3 topics left to go. We just finished punctuating SWABIs at the beginning of a sentence. Now we're going to focus on how we should punctuate SWABIs when they show up in the middle of a sentence. So I'm going to hit begin, and I'm going to go to the practice. And I've told you guys this along. Every time you see a SWABI in the middle of a sentence, you do not need a comma before it. I am not going to say that just because you see a SWABI in the middle of a sentence doesn't mean that that sentence doesn't have a comma somewhere in it. And I'll show you what I mean by that when we get to our next section in No Red Ink, our next big section. We're going to start talking about sentences that are compound and complex. So they have a fanboy and they have a SWABI in them. But for now, we're just focusing on when we have a SWABI in the middle of a sentence. Do we need a comma before that SWABI? And the answer is always going to be no, we do not. When we have SWABIs at the beginning of a sentence, we have what's called a dependent clause. And we have to put a comma at the end of that dependent clause because we have to wait for more information. But when the SWABI shows up in the middle of the sentence, we already have more information, and we're going to keep going to receive the rest of the information. We don't need to pause. We're not waiting on anything. It's all together. Zuri Ross studied extremely hard because she wanted to win the Scrabble competition. This word because shows up in the middle of the sentence. I do not need a comma in front of the word because. I could submit this answer as is. Just to have a little teachable moment here, I do want to explain to you that this sentence could be rewritten, and it could say at the beginning, because she wanted to win the Scrabble competition, comma, Zuri Ross studied extremely hard. You can flip-flop where this subordinating conjunction is in a sentence as long as you follow the grammar rules. So I could very easily, if No Red Ink would let me shift these around, I could very easily put the word because at the beginning of the sentence and then say because she wanted to win the Scrabble competition, comma, Zuri Ross studied extremely hard. And I would still have the same sentence, but I would have the dependent clause in the beginning, not going towards the end. So because it shows up in the middle, not at the beginning, I can go ahead and submit my answer as is. We don't need a comma before it. This section shouldn't trip you up at all because we know that we're focusing on those SWABIs when they're in the middle of the sentence. And the grammar rule says when they're in the middle of the sentence, we do not need a comma before the SWABIs. So for this one, you can literally just take the commas out if they're there, or you can just submit the answer as is if they're not there. I don't want you to just run off and do that. I want you to understand that because they're in the middle of the sentence, we don't need the comma. They're not showing up at the beginning. They're not requiring a comma. They're in the middle. They're fine just by themselves. So that should have been a very easy section.